she's sat here for over 3 decades on this small creek off the Ohio River. She's been called a ghost ship, a paradise for urban explorers, and a fun destination for kayakers. But her history has been largely forgotten, except by a small group of enthusiasts. This vessel is over 120 years old, served in both World Wars, and has an interesting connection to the Lusitania disaster.
Originally, we were told it was built for President Theodore Roosevelt.
She went by many names: the Celt, the USS Fennecyte, the Sightseer, the Circle Line 5, but most often she was known as the SS Sachem. In this adventure, we're stepping aboard her, seeing what remains, and diving into her history like never before. But before we dive into the history of this ship, please subscribe and turn on post notifications so you'll be alerted with each future video. The story of the Sachem began over 120 years ago, 3 states away. Pusey and Jones Shipyard in Wilmington, Delaware was founded in 1848 and boomed during the American Civil War, making sloops and cargo vessels for the Union. They continued after the war making groundbreaking ships, including the first iron-hulled ship built in the U.S., and also some racing yachts, including winners of the America's Cup. They furnished some large vessels with their engines, including the paddle steamer T.J. Potter, which sailed the Columbia River in Oregon, and is a shipwreck that I've also filmed for my channel. But they also made luxury yachts, and the ship we're exploring today was both a luxury yacht and a racing yacht. Yard number 306 was commissioned in 1901 by a man named John Rogers Maxwell. Maxwell was a businessman and owned more railroads than a Railroad Tycoon 2 player on Windows 98, with stakes in the Lackawanna and Western Railroad, the Durango Central Railroad, and the Central Railroad of New Jersey, in addition to being president of the Atlas Portland Cement Company, which later supplied materials for the Panama Canal and the Empire State Building. Well, this man was obviously a millionaire, and the next natural step for him was that he wanted a luxury steam yacht. Maxwell was Irish-American and chose the name Celt for his yacht. She was to be 186 feet in length, 24 feet wide, with a gross tonnage of around 217 tons. When we peer down into her engine room from the main deck, we see a newer engine rather than the ship's original 4-cylinder triple expansion steam engine. However, we also see several exposed crossbeams, part of her framing. Celt was built with 100 of these steel frames, from her stem to her stern, all neatly riveted together. It was on April 12, 1902 that Celt was launched into the Christina River of Wilmington, after which she was towed to the yard's fitting out wharf. Here her interiors were completed, smaller machinery installed, and this ornate scrollwork on the bow was added. So many beautiful details like this were lost over time, and decades of repurposing and remodeling have removed nearly every last remnant of her early yacht years. Nothing remains of these lavish interior fittings she once had. 9 richly furnished staterooms, each with electric fans, ice boxes, and finished in mahogany. She had plenty of bathrooms on board, tiled in green, with mosaic floors. Got tiles there. There must have been a head right here. Toilet. I did actually find some green tiling on board, in an area that was certainly once a bathroom. Could this actually be the final trace of her luxury yacht interior? Well, that certainly is Victorian-era wrought iron on top of the tiling, so I take that back. I suppose there actually is something remaining from her early years. In addition to the passenger quarters, this was obviously a very large vessel that required her own dedicated crew. The owner couldn't simply have a fleet captain that drove whichever ship he wanted driven that day. No, the Celt actually required its own dedicated captain, stewards, cooks, engineers, and firemen for the boilers. The Celt was delivered ahead of schedule to Maxwell for a sum of $250,000. Maxwell was pleased with his gorgeous new yacht, the flagship of his fleet of 27 personal crafts. It plied the waters of Long Island Sound for almost a decade, often turning heads and impressing everyone who sailed on her. With each passing summer, her fans grew in number, to the point where Maxwell began chartering the vessel out to his rich friends. In 1910, just off of Battery Park, Manhattan, Kelt ran into a barge, damaging both vessels, but minimally. She was patched up within 4 months and sent on her way, but shortly after that, her owner, John Maxwell, passed away. His widow sold the Kelt to a new owner, a man named Manton Metcalf. Metcalf loved the boat, making it his own private yacht, but renamed her the Sachem. It was most often seen in New England waters between Long Island and Rhode Island, always proudly flying the flags of her owner. In 1914, Metcalf gave the Sachem a complete overhaul. However, trouble was brewing overseas. On May 7, 1915, the Cunard liner RMS Lusitania was attacked and sunk by German U-boat U-20. Germany had been engaging in unrestricted warfare against Allied shipping, and even though the United States was neutral, it was apparent that the U.S. would soon be entering the fight against the Kaiser. Thomas Edison, famed New Jersey inventor, had long been pushing for the U.S. government to support his research into anti-submarine tactics and technology, and the aftermath of the Lusitania finally gave Edison's requests the attention they deserved. However, it would still be a solid 2 years before any actual support arrived. It was in 1917 that the United States finally entered the war. The U.S. Navy was leasing private yachts from citizens for coastal defense and other at-home military purposes, and our friend Manton Metcalf lent them the Sachem. Now, the SS Sachem was officially the USS Sachem, with the designation of SP-192. The first proper assignment the USS Sachem was given was a 10-week loan to Thomas Edison. The ship was kitted up for dozens of experiments, the supplies for the 10 weeks, and modified to accommodate the inventor, his wife, his son, and his crew of up to 20 technicians. For these 10 weeks, the Sachem sailed up and down the East Coast, out past Florida, and even into the Caribbean. Now, it's easy to believe that this voyage was more about pleasure than business, and indeed Edison did enjoy himself, but he got very little rest. They got a ton of stuff done in terms of experiments and trying out new things. They developed camouflage methods for various vessels, and his notes seem to indicate that it was used on a Cunard ship. They developed ways to minimize a ship's turning radius when under attack, improved the abilities of maritime searchlights, and even developed the precursor to radar. Edison used these specific successes to later go on and establish the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. Now, I know that's a very generic name, but it is an official department of the U.S. military. So, one could actually argue that the USS Sachem right here was the first official U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. This is something of incredible historical significance. And yet, she's sitting here in the mud, rotting away in the middle of nowhere. All told, Edison conducted experiments on 49 different projects aboard the Sachem, many of which were successful, but the Navy lost interest in this work and recalled the ship the following spring. Instead, the Sachem was fitted out for coastal patrols. She was fitted with two 37mm cannons on the bow and a 57mm cannon on the stern, as well as machine guns and depth charges. Sachem patrolled the entire east coast of the United States but never saw combat. Sachem was returned to her civilian owner, Manton Metcalf. He kept it briefly as a yacht but sold it to Philadelphia banker Rowland Taylor. As the Prohibition era came to the United States when alcohol was banned nationwide, Taylor used the ship as a rum runner. Sort of as a mothership kind of thing where he would anchor it offshore and then have a smaller boat smuggle the alcohol to a local coastal village. He did occasionally use Sachem as a personal yacht, but the Prohibition era was succeeded by the Great Depression, and in 1932 Rowland Taylor sold Sachem for a fraction of her worth. It was bought by a Captain Jacob Martin, who used it as a charter boat for fishing parties out of New York and New Jersey. Here's Captain Martin, standing aboard the Sachem shortly after he purchased it. He's on the starboard side upper deck facing forward. I'd absolutely love to have been able to recreate this angle while I was on board and inset this photo as I do in a lot of my videos, but the upper deck doesn't exist anymore. However, just so you know, he's standing right around this spot. Business for Captain Martin prospered. His vessel could accommodate 250 passengers per voyage, and the luxury yacht fixtures inside made it a popular choice for charters. Within just a few years, Martin wanted to give the Sachem an overhaul, replacing the old coal boilers and steam engines with a more modern diesel engine. It was indeed cost-effective, but it had a lower horsepower and therefore a slower speed output. This engine from 1936, ordered by Martin and built by Fairbanks Morse, is the engine that we see on board her today. Now, some of you may recognize Fairbanks Morse as the company that built the coal tower in Thurmond, West Virginia, featured in one of my other documentaries. Funny enough, I explored the SS Sachem the day before I filmed my documentary on Thurmond. Fairbanks Morse was a company I'd never heard of, and I encountered them twice in a single weekend. Anyway, it was a 7-cylinder 37D14 diesel engine, which generated 805 horsepower. The engine room today is flooded out and completely inaccessible, but I was able to lean down and reach the camera inside. The engine sits in mud and water, rusting away, despite the fact that it is one of only 3 surviving diesel engines of this type left in the world. The high for Martin didn't last long. On February 17, 1942, 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the entrance of the United States into the Second World War, the U.S. Navy requisitioned the SS Sachem once more. This time, they rented her from Martin for $65,000, and that would last for the duration of the war. Unlike in the First World War, where the Sachem managed to maintain her charm throughout the war and preserve most of her fine interiors, this time around, the Navy completely changed her. You'd almost be unable to tell that she was once a millionaire's high-class yacht. Instead, she looked a little bit like a Navy corvette and was ready to chase down any U-boat that she encountered. She was rearmed once more, this time with a 3-inch gun on her stern, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and 2 depth-charge racks. In the end, she was practically a completely different vessel. As such, she was given a new name, the USS Fenakite. Captain Harold Homefield, seen here at her helm, was her commander during this time.
We were told it was built for President Theodore Roosevelt. This was completely refitted. They put on armor plate all around. We had the same caliber cannon, we call it a 3-inch 50 gun, on our vessel, with lots of machine guns around.
Her primary use for the first part of the war was coastal patrol, but in late 1944 she was reassigned to the Fleet Sonar School Squadron of Key West, Florida, where she primarily acted as a sonar trainer for new recruits.
And our job was to take out people who were attending classes at the sonar school, learning anti-submarine warfare. And we and about 10 other ships or so working from the same area would take out these groups, enlisted personnel and officer personnel separately. We'd work with our own submarines. We had about a dozen World War I submarines that were being utilized to do this work.
The Fenakite was ready for action if she ever encountered the enemy on her training missions, but this never occurred. By the end of the war, the Fenakite had still never seen significant enemy action. However, the war wasn't completely uneventful for her. In 1943, Fenakite was involved in a rescue of a ship that was torpedoed, and later she unsuccessfully pursued a German U-boat after it had shot down a U.S. Navy blimp. Her captain, who lived to be 99 years old, also recalled, among other stories, a terrible experience while the ship was on patrol.
Sitting in the wardroom, finishing my breakfast, and one of the officers came in, white-faced, "Man overboard." So, of course, I rushed out there and saw that there was a sailor in the water, and he was sort of struggling. And I knew from my Red Cross training that you get a boat out there, you don't jump in yourself. We were operating in shark-infested waters. Well, anyhow, this poor young fellow that suddenly went under and didn't come up again. And so we kept looking way into the night. We were never able to recover the body. So it was obvious to us that some shark had gotten him.
She was initially supposed to be returned to her civilian owner, Jacob Martin, but the Navy kept such poor maintenance on her that they didn't tell Martin and they just offered her for scrap. Well, Martin found out about this and he had to actually buy his own ship from the Navy. I think it was around $5,000. However, after taking such a financial hit and finally seeing the damage they had done to her, he realized he didn't have the money needed for repairs. In 1946, he was forced to put her up for sale. Meanwhile, there was a sightseeing company in New York City known as Circle Line Sightseeing Cruises. Well, they were called that because, well, they circled Manhattan. They purchased the Sachem, which had been reverted back to her civilian name, and once more renamed her. This time, they called her the Sightseer. The stripping that the U.S. Navy did to her gave the Circle Line more or less a blank slate to do what they wanted. They were proud of her wartime service, and they wanted to maintain that modern steel warship feeling that she got from the U.S. Navy, but they also wanted to embrace her fine yacht lines and go back to her origins. In the meantime, her superstructure was enlarged so that the ship could now accommodate up to 500 passengers, far more than her initial builders had ever dreamed she'd be carrying. She sailed with the Circle Line for years, popular with their customers as the fleet's flagship. She would round Manhattan on 3-hour voyages, departing the company's new location at Pier 83, sailing south to the Statue of Liberty. From there, she'd sail around Battery Park and north up the East River. She'd sail through the Harlem River and then back south along the Hudson, passing the ocean liner terminals until returning to her home pier. These voyages were often said to be the best way to view the city, and the Sightseer, former Sachem, was the most popular of their vessels. In the late 1950s, she was renamed the Circle Line 5 as the company restructured their fleet. On the bow, her Circle Line name was painted, still visible today on both sides. At some point, they removed the ship's classic original wooden wheelhouse and replaced it with a more modern one. In 1977, after 31 years of serving the Circle Line and carrying nearly 3 million passengers, she was deemed obsolete as her operating costs were too high and she was retired. She was stripped of anything useful, donated to the Sea Scouts, towed to the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, and she sat there, seemingly abandoned. There were actually passive efforts to maintain her, perhaps even eventually restore her to her former glory, but these always fell through, usually because of money reasons. The years went on and the ship fell further and further into disrepair. Well, that is until 1986, when Robert Miller, a businessman and a maritime enthusiast, decided that he wanted to buy the ship as his own personal pleasure yacht. He paid $7,500 for her, and he promised to have her towed out and removed from the site within 7 days. The first thing he did was he renamed her the Sachem once more, and for the following weeks he would tow her from pier to pier all around the Hudson, basically dodging mooring fees and skipping out on paying, as he was doing the basic maintenance to the vessel. All the while, he was making the 10-hour drive from his home near Cincinnati, Ohio, all the way out to New York Harbor, and back, every weekend. It was around this time, when Robert was working on the ship, that a limousine pulled up onto the dock, and a music studio producer got out and approached Robert and explained that they were producing a music video for Madonna's new song, Papa Don't Preach. And he asked him, "Can we use the Sachem in the background?" He agreed, and the ship makes a brief cameo appearance in the video. Well, Robert couldn't keep dodging those mooring fees for long. nor could he keep driving 20 hours a week to work on the ship. Nor could he keep vandals off of her, who had now twice broken into her, stole his tools, and stripped things off of the ship. Now, what he had to do is, if he wanted to keep her, he needed to bring her home so that he could work on her more regularly and keep a closer eye on her. But the ship couldn't move. The Fairbanks Morse engine inside of her was dead, and she was in terrible condition. She was too big to haul over land, so what could he do? Well, from that pier in New Jersey, in the summer of 1988, he set out on what was no doubt an incredible adventure. He, along with his wife, some friends, and his dog, set sail up the Hudson River, through the Erie Canal, through the Great Lakes, into Chicago, and down the Mississippi River, and then back up the Ohio River to his property in Kentucky, near Cincinnati, Ohio. A 2,600-mile voyage on an aging vessel that now looked more like a drug smuggler's boat in Southeast Asia than a former luxury yacht. To make this incredible journey, he improvised a number of fittings and machinery on the ship, including a makeshift helm on the upper deck. He essentially had a lawn chair up there on that deck that he would steer from, and an engine mounted down below him. And to control that engine from his lawn chair, he had a broomstick that he would just lean back and poke at the engine until it did what he wanted. But that engine, that was by far the wildest improvisation he had.
He cut out a portion of bulwark from the fantail and welded a Z-drive propulsion unit. To power it, he used an old bulldozer engine that he salvaged.
In ideal conditions, he could make 8 knots, but when going against currents, he could barely do 2 knots.
That old bulldozer engine is still mounted on the ship's fantail, although the odds and ends off of it have been pilfered by souvenir hunters.
Somehow the Sachem's final voyage from New Jersey to Kentucky seemed more like a grungy trip on a makeshift junkyard raft than a triumphant voyage of an antique vessel on her way to restoration. Now, Robert and his team were actually detained by Canadian port authorities because when they were sailing through Lake Huron, they accidentally crossed into Canadian waters. They were briefly detained, but things were sorted out and they were allowed to continue on their way pretty quickly. The Sachem puttered up the Ohio River, worn out and exhausted, and was tucked into a small tributary near Petersburg, Kentucky. At the time, this was Miller's property, and from here, he'd be able to work on her more regularly. His incredible journey was over, but the same might be said for the Sachem herself.
Miller was out of money. On top of that, the water level in the river dropped, and the ship now stuck hard in the mud. Miller, at this point, gave up.
He eventually retired, sold this land, and moved to Mexico. He always hoped that some restoration efforts would come together and take the ship off of his hands and she'd be given a new life. But there was no such luck, at least not yet. Robert Miller died in 2016, and the Sachem still sits here in the same mud that she got stuck in over 30 years ago.
The Sachem now sits all but abandoned on a small creek feeding into the Ohio River. The hull has rusted through in many areas, exposing every last compartment of her to the river. Nothing on the ship remains watertight, and fewer parts of her upper portion are structurally sound. I kayaked out to her, again after seeking permission in advance, and I climbed aboard. The gun mounts from her service in the Second World War are still on her deck, having been preserved by the Circle Line as part of her heritage, but they're now buried deep under nearly a foot of silt and mud.
Just look at how thick the mud has caked on this deck.
Mud so thick that foliage and even a full tree are growing from it. This visit was in the winter, when more of the vessel would be exposed, but in the summer, the ship looks like a garden, covered in green and in parts impenetrable by brush. Her stern points out towards the river, the old bulldozer engine hanging off the fantail, and the after compartments sit deeper in the water. It was impossible to access the lower levels, but we could peer down at times. This companionway may have led down to a galley area, as the compartment below was adjacent to the dining room. If her layout can be compared to the other luxury yachts by Pusey and Jones, then this compartment, forward of her engine room, would have been staterooms, likely one on either side of the ship, and a corridor up the center line. The next compartment forward may have been crew or additional staterooms. We can see tanks at the bottom of this compartment, likely part of a CO2 fire suppression system. I wouldn't be surprised if that was added by the US Navy. The forepeak, the one and only compartment not flooded at the river's current height. Walking along the promenade on the sides of the ship reminds me of much of the ship's history. I wonder how many people stood along these railings, waving to friends, or pointing out fish as they drifted by, or shooting at them. A stairwell was added on the after deck by the Circle Line for a second level of passengers. Although today, I wouldn't trust those steps one bit. The Circle Line, by the way, which owned the Sachem for over 30 years and by far got the most mileage out of her, is still in business today, offering tours of Manhattan, and are indeed one of the best ways to see the city if you ever visit. The Celt, the Sachem, the Fennikite, the Sightseer, the Circle Line 5, the ghost ship of the Ohio River. Call her what you will, but she's a fascinating piece of obscure maritime history rapidly being claimed by nature. Perhaps her story isn't over, or perhaps it ended over 30 years ago. There is actually a grassroots effort that still wants to restore her and take her out of here and turn her into some sort of a museum ship, converting her and bringing her back to life. It would be a monumental undertaking just to move her out of this mud, to say nothing about the work needed to repair her. However, given her rich history, you would almost think that even the US Navy would want to step up. I mean, this is the first official US Naval Research Laboratory. Thomas Edison sailed aboard her for 10 weeks, and up to 4 US presidents were on board. We know Warren G. Harding, and we know Herbert Hoover. It's possible that Teddy Roosevelt and FDR were on board. That's both the Roosevelts. Two very opposite people, but, the same ship. And not at the same time. You can find out more about the Sachem at uss-sachem.org. Those historians actually helped with the research and material that went into this video to make sure that this documentary thoroughly told the entire history of the Sachem, so that she's properly documented no matter what her future holds. Well, thank you very much for exploring the history of the Sachem with me. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video, comment if you want, and please share the video as well. As always, thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankertz, Gabriel Colombe, Nick K, RGB, Rob M, Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin Chen, John Miluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Manti Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sohi Fraser, and Nikki Chan 92.